Welcome to another session of the Psychedelic Assisted Therapy Global Summit. I'm Dr. Ron Siegel. I'm a psychologist here in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States at Harvard Medical School. I'll be your co-host for the session. And today I have the great pleasure of interviewing Dr. Gabor Mate. Welcome, Gabor.
Nice to be with you, Ron. Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining the summit. I'd like to share a little bit about your background with our viewers, and then we can launch into the questions. So, Dr. Gabor Mate is a retired physician who, after 20 years of family practice and palliative care experience, worked for over a decade in Vancouver's downtown East Side with patients challenged by drug addiction and mental illness. The best-selling author of 4 books published in 30 languages, including the award-winning In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, Gabor is an internationally renowned speaker, highly sought after for his expertise on addiction, trauma, childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. For his groundbreaking medical work and writing, he's been awarded the Order of Canada, which is Canada's highest civilian distinction, and the Civic Merit Award from his hometown, Vancouver. And he's just completed his 5th book, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture, which I've had the privilege of having an advanced copy of and got to read some of. And much of what we'll talk about actually is chronicled in the book in very interesting ways. We're really lucky to have Gabor with us since we're recording this just days before his new book is being released, and he's in great demand around it. And in looking through the advanced copy, I can attest that it is a clear, engaging, and really wide-ranging synthesis that gets to the heart of what ails us in modern cultures and how really our attempts to make ourselves feel better, rather short-sighted attempts, wind up increasing our suffering in the long run. And he illuminates in particular how conventional Western medicine has really missed the mark by failing to address the connection between our unresolved emotional injuries, including both small and large, and our various medical and behavioral problems. And he really shows us an alternative path to healing that would come from addressing the actual engine behind so many of these maladies. And of particular interest to the summit, in the book, he talks compellingly not only about how he's seen psychedelics be transformational for patients he's worked with and the like, but he's talked about his own personal transformative journey and how they've helped him to work with early trauma. So I think you're going to find this to be a very engaging and illuminating conversation. So with that as a background and with deep appreciation for all the work that went into the book, because it is so thoroughly researched and so carefully and accessibly written, I'd like to start where you start in presenting your argument, which is really focusing on trauma as a central component of our suffering, both psychological and medical. And, some clinicians and lay people think of trauma as what happens when we experience horrific, out of the ordinary kinds of events that leave us scars. What you in the book and many others will sometimes call big T or capital T trauma. Yet you also emphasize the importance of small t or little t trauma and developmental trauma, the kind that happens in our early years. And I wonder if you could help give viewers a sense of these different kinds of trauma and the different ways that you've seen them interact to shape people's lives, because I think these are the engine that cause so much of the suffering that we'll be addressing when we talk about the use of psychedelics.
Yes. So if we begin with the unifying understanding that trauma is not whatever happens to you, but what happens inside you as a result of what happens or sometimes what doesn't happen to you, then we understand the word's Greek origin, which means a wound or wounding. So trauma is a psychic wound. And we can incur wounds really in 2 broad ways. When bad things happen to children or adults that shouldn't happen, such as sexual, physical, emotional abuse, all the adverse childhood experiences, a parent dying, addiction in the family, violence in the family, poverty, of course, racism, neglect. So children can be hurt that way. That's usually called the big T traumas. But children can also be wounded, again, going back to the Greek origin of the word, not by bad things happening that shouldn't have, but the good things that should have happened not happening. In other words, human beings can be wounded by their needs not being met. And as human beings, we have certain developmental needs for emotional safety, for being accepted for exactly who we are, for secure attachment relationships where we don't have to work to make that relationship work. We don't have to be good, nice, smart, pretty, successful. We don't have to suppress any parts of ourselves in order to be accepted and welcomed. We have the need as children or as human beings to be able to experience all our feelings, whether they are enjoyable for the people, whether they're not, but we have the need to experience them all. Without that, we're not full. So children can be wounded not because terrible things happen to them, but because the good things that should have happened are not available. And in our culture, owing to a whole lot of reasons, a lot of children are wounded not because bad things were happened to them, but because their needs were not met. So the wound is sustained, and the impacts of that wound show up in both physical and mental illness.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is your clinical experience, but it has been mine that sometimes when the trauma is the trauma of omission rather than commission in this way, things look so good on the outside that it's even more confusing to people. How come I'm having these reactions and how come I'm so upset? I had a childhood that was good. Look at the photographs.
Well, in the book, I talk about the myth of the happy childhood. And Ron, I've had this conversation umpteen number of times in many venues and many different countries where somebody will say, well, doc, I had autoimmune disease, or I had cancer, or I have an addiction, or I have depression, and I had a totally happy childhood. Then that's when I issue what I call the happy childhood challenge. And you just ask a few basic questions. And it turns out that, yes, there may have been happiness, but there was also a lot of unresolved pain. Now, the reason people have trouble with that is that they have nothing to compare it to. You know, you can't compare it to a different childhood where you had your needs met. And people don't recall what didn't happen. But what didn't happen, as I was saying earlier, can be just as important as what did happen. So that myth of the happy childhood has stumped a lot of people and sometimes a lot of clinicians. But you ask a few questions, it turns out, yeah, there was pain there. There was unresolved trauma. There was unsupported suffering in virtually all cases.
Yeah. Do you see situations in which sometimes people become conscious of it when they become parents themselves, and all of a sudden they notice that they don't really have the requisite, responses aren't flowing naturally in order to take care of their own kids?
That's certainly true for a lot of cases. It was certainly true for me. And although I was also quite aware of the overt traumas, but even in rats, they've shown in a laboratory how a mother rat responds to the infant in the first few hours or couple of days of life will then be how that infant deals with their children, their offspring, when they become mothers. And if anybody thinks these are genetic patterns, they're not, because if you put young rats or infant rats with mothers who nurture them optimally, they will become mothers who nurture optimally. If you take the pups of mothers who do nurture optimally, but you put them with mothers who don't, they themselves will not nurture optimally. So these are learned, or I should say developed responses based on very early experience. And yes, it's very often in our parenting or through our own suffering as adults that we begin to realize that maybe things weren't as rosy as we had liked to have imagined.
Yeah. I mean, my understanding is sometimes these changes are epigenetic, so that, not to make this too complicated, but even if you take the pup who has perfectly good genes because their mom was good, but you raise them with a mom who doesn't know how to take care of a pup, and then you look at what happens to the grandchildren, to the children of that pup, they've somehow inherited a genetic code which doesn't know how to feel okay in the world and doesn't know how to take care of a rat pup.
Well, just to correct that slightly, they don't inherit a genetic code. The genes don't change, but how those genes are triggered or expressed is changed.
Yes, right. Yeah, that's more technically correct. That it's an epigenetic change rather than a change in the DNA itself. But what gets turned on or not is changed. Yeah, thank you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, just to take the devil's advocate a little bit, because I hear this sometimes when I have the same sense that you're describing, which is that, oh my gosh, everybody who I'm working with who has either physical symptoms or psychological and behavioral difficulties, it's usually either something really painful happened because of commission or this omission. But sometimes broadening our understanding of trauma this way, brings up this other argument. Like, are we running the danger of making everybody think that they're traumatized, and even worse, making people develop kind of identities around being traumatized, in which they'll go through the world saying, well, I can't do this developmental task, I can't do that challenge because I'll be triggered, and I want to avoid being triggered. And since I know it comes up as an argument often, I wondered, I imagine you've heard it, and I wonder what you think about that and how you respond to it.
Well, I think there's a lot of important concepts wrapped up in that question. So, first of all, I'm telling you, if as a physician or you as a psychologist, I'd make the bold statement that in the vast majority of cases, if they had not been traumatized, they would not be in your office or in my office in the first place. No matter how they recall their childhood, they just wouldn't be there, because it was those omissions and commissions that went wrong that has them develop the symptoms or the pathologies or the anxieties that bring them to our offices, or the physical illnesses that bring them to my office. So that's the first point. The second point is, the subtitle of the book is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. We live in a culture where very few people escape the marks of trauma. So that's the second point. Now, the third point about making an identity out of it, well, that's different, because you don't help anybody by helping them, by trying to help them identify with their trauma as if that was the real person. The trauma is the wound. The trauma is not who you are.
Yeah.
Who you are as a human being to sustain the wound. So that doesn't make you a victim, because a victim is a passive recipient of suffering or experience of suffering without any capacity to do anything about it. So the whole point of working therapeutically with people, as both you and I do, is to help them gain agency, precisely so that they're not controlled by what happened to them a long time ago. And if we didn't believe in that capacity of human beings, we wouldn't be doing the work that we're doing. And of course, as I'm sure we'll get to, this is where psychedelics can play an interesting role in helping people not become victims. So nobody in that sense is a victim, but that doesn't mean that they hadn't suffered. And in this society, there are very few, I would argue, who escape the imprints of trauma. That's the nature of the culture that we live in.
Right. And one of the things that you address in the book, which has always been, such a clear piece of evidence to me career-wise, is that what are called ACE scores, which are basically if a doctor does ask a patient about certain common adverse childhood events, that's where the ACE comes from, that there's amazing correlation between the number of adverse childhood events people have and what's going to happen to their physical and mental health.
Exactly. The more of them you accrue, the greater your risk for addiction, psychosis, depression, anxiety, ADHD, autoimmune disease, malignancy, sexually transmitted disease, violent behavior, all kinds of stuff. I would only add that there's something that the ACEs don't look at. The ACEs look at what happened that shouldn't have, but they don't look at what didn't happen that should have. And this is where that confusion that you and I talked about earlier often shows up. I didn't have any of those things happen to me, but I'm suffering. Well, this is where we have to look at what didn't happen but should have.
Yeah, and that's a very important part of it. So now let's talk about psychedelics, since it's the theme of our summit here. And you have fascinating stories in your new book about powerful experiences facilitating retreats in the Amazon with master curanderos, the people who guide folks, in particular on ayahuasca journeys. And for our viewers who may be new to this and not familiar with this medicine, can you say a little bit about just generally what it is, how you've seen it used, and how it compares to other psychedelics that maybe people do have familiarity with?
Well, it was after my book on addiction came up, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, that as I traveled around speaking about addiction and the relationship of addiction to trauma, actually, that people kept asking me, what do I know about the healing of addiction and ayahuasca? And I'd have to say, I don't know anything about it. And I'd go on to my next question, and then another visit in another town, somebody put their hands up and say, "Hey, what do you know about the healing of addiction?" And I was going to say nothing until I actually got, frankly, resentful of the question, because I thought, my God, I've just spent 3 years writing this book, pouring everything I knew into it, and you keep asking me about the one thing I had never even heard about. So, but eventually I got curious. I thought, well, maybe fate is knocking on my door here, and somebody told me I could experience the plant here in Vancouver where I live. So I did. Now, what ayahuasca is a combination. It's a plant, or a combination of two plants usually, that grows in the Amazon jungle of Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil. And the native indigenous people there have, in each of these countries, developed their own tradition of healing. Now, how they actually figured out that these two plants brewed together and mixed and boiled for 8 hours would yield this concoction that would give you these transformative spiritual or healing experiences, that's another one of those mysteries. Now when you ask the shamans, how did they know that these two plants, because out of the 20,000 plants in the Amazon, how do they know that these two? I mean, in a modern laboratory, it would take them a million years to figure this out. How do you take 20,000 plants and figure out which two will give you this particular effect? You know what the shamans say? They said, we listen to the plants.
Uh,
So and I know that indigenous people here in British Columbia, they talk about listening to the plants. And you know what? As much as my Western trained, intellectually left wired brain has trouble understanding that, I believe them, because I've seen indigenous people commune with the plants here in British Columbia. It's a totally different level of experience that our minds in the mainstream world are used to. So in any case, there are these two plants and you brew them together, and then you have experiences that just, either through visions or through insights or through physiological experiences, or a combination of all of them, they just guide you deeply into your unconscious. Now, that can show up in the form of spirit guides that show up. I have to tell you, no spirit guide has ever showed up for me. I've never seen anacondas or jaguars like a lot of people have. The plant never came to me and said, "Hey, I'm your mom. I'm going to help you." My brain is far more prosaic than that. But that's not the point. The point is that, as all psychedelics, they take you below the level of the conscious mind and beyond the possibilities of the narrowly determined conscious mind. Now, actually, traditionally in the Amazon, it wouldn't be the clients who would take the plant, the brew, it would be the shaman. And the shaman would then energetically connect with the individual, and they would sense what they needed. So the healing was coming through the shaman, and the shaman would alter their state of being through using the plant. More recently, it's shaman and client both take the plant. So the interesting point here is that it's not necessarily the physiological effect of the plant by itself that has the impact, but actually the energetic exchange between the shaman and the participant. Now, having said that, in modern days, people will take the plant, so will the shaman, and then the shamans chant. These are called icaros, or chants, and whatever language, the Shipibo language in Peru, where I had my experiences, but I've also been in Colombia. Sometimes the chants are in Spanish, sometimes in other Aboriginal languages. The songs themselves evoke emotions and evoke experiences in an individual. And my first experience was just pure love. I just experienced love, and it wasn't love for anybody in particular. Just love as a state of being. I had tears of joy and love coursing down my cheeks, and I knew why people kept asking me, because I understood that my own addictive behaviors and those of all the people that I'd worked with happened because they had been closed off to love, because their hearts were so bruised early in life as mine had been. And when you recognize the pain that you've been running from, but you also experience a state where there's no need to run anywhere, then healing can begin. And so that was my initiation. And now that's putting it in a nutshell. It's not as simple as that. It's not as overnight as all that. It's not as immediate as all that. But that was my introductory experience. It's a bit like, I have to say, like drug pushers will give you one free, and then, so I had this great experience, and I thought, oh my God, well, the next night it was pure hell, Mm-hmm. So this is no rose garden we're talking about here. We're talking about really confronting all the stuff that you're carrying inside.
Yeah. So before we get into how that works to heal, just a couple of strands that I want to ask you more about, because it's so fascinating. So you're saying is traditionally this is used. I'm going to translate it into very Western terms. This is used as therapist training. These medicines were used to make therapists so intuitively and energetically opened up and connected that they could much more effectively facilitate healing in their clients or patients.
Yes, exactly. And of course, before they get to the point where they can call themselves shamans or curanderos, they have to go through intense training and really work through their own suffering and become that wounded healer very consciously. It's not an easy path that they're trained extremely rigorously. I mean, their training is more rigorous, I might say, than most Western therapists. Yeah. But also, when they ingest the plant, they just become energetic sensors of whoever is sitting in front of them. I can totally believe that, because having worked also with MDMA, I know when I take MDMA, I can become extraordinarily in tune with somebody else and actually read them, and not just read them, but sense them. So, I mean, I could do some damn good therapy with somebody who didn't take MDMA, but I had, and I'm not recommending this, people. I'm just saying that I understand that experience. Same with mushrooms, by the way.
I was with a group of therapists who were doing some of our own exploration and training, if you will. And I remember thinking, because as people who've been watching the series know, that MDMA for PTSD is now in phase 3 trials and all of that. And there's the whole question of, will insurance cover this and how and the like. And it occurred to me, maybe insurance shouldn't cover therapy from therapists who haven't had MDMA experiences. Now, I know that's a little extreme, but because it felt like, oh my gosh, does this ever heighten the capacity to be with, to sense, to have compassion, to feel love, and to get out of the way, to not be all preoccupied with, in my case, how's Ron doing as a therapist, but to actually be with the other person.
I actually would push back against you saying that this is extreme. I think it's actually makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. And I really do think in this case, I don't know what other people will say about it, but my personal opinion is that if you're going to work with MDMA, work on yourself first with MDMA, because you really want to know what that client will be experiencing. Otherwise, you're just not equipped to guide them as expertly and as sensitively as really you should. So
and I think, just to clarify one thing, I think there's a fair amount of agreement about that point. The question is, how about doing therapy generally that has nothing to do with psychedelics? Is it important for therapists to have had some kind of experience like the ayahuasqueros had before sitting with their people, or like a Western therapist might experience if they had explored MDMA and explored deeply that experience before just doing regular non-psychedelic therapy?
Are you asking, is it important that people should delve deeply into their own psyches before they do work with others? Look, I have a standard joke, forgive me, somebody may be offended, but I often ask people, what do you call somebody who tries to fix in somebody else that which they haven't resolved in themselves? And you call them psychiatrists, And it used to be a part of psychiatric training, or certainly psychoanalytic training, that whatever you think about psychoanalysis, and I have all kinds of mixed feelings about it, but at least people have to go through their own process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Modern society very often trains people who don't have to look at themselves at all. They just learn certain biologically narrow facts about, not sometimes non-facts about the human brain, and then they're expected to go out there and treat people who are deeply traumatized without even recognizing that the trauma is there. And that's partly because they haven't looked at their own.
Right.
So I mean, when I teach my students, I mean, I have a course that I teach in therapy called Compassion Inquiry. And when we've had about 3,000 students in 80 countries in the last 3 years or so, and people sometimes think they're going to come here and learn some kind of a skill set. Then they find out that no, the first 3 months is all about them. And very few, and we give them the option to leave. If that's too much for them, that's okay, I understand. But you're not going to be a therapist in my world unless you do your own work. And, so much of what you and I do has to do with mirroring people. Well, how can we be mirrors if we don't clear our own budget? I mean, it's just that simple.
Yeah. And it's, just to not pick on psychiatry is the only profession. There are psychologists these days who train in just studying which 8-week manualized treatments have been shown to be empirically supported, and where it's not expected that they would do some kind of inner inquiry and really try to integrate all the split off parts of ourselves that got split off because of injuries of various sorts.
Let me tell you a horror story, okay? If I may.
Sure.
I was speaking at a conference in Norway maybe 5 years ago now on addiction. And amongst the other speakers were two very prominent Americans. I will not name them. One of them was a psychiatrist of national renown who actually helped to edit one of the editions of the DSM. The other was a person as high up as you can get in the CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy world, of psychology. The night before the conference, we had dinner together, the presenters, and I asked one of them, "Where do you live?" And they said, "I live in San Diego." I said, "You must know Vince Felitti." And they said, "No, who is he?" And I said, "Well, Dr. Vince Felitti happens to be the lead investigator of the adverse childhood experiences studies." They both said, "What are those?"
Mm.
Now, this is a psychiatrist and a leading psychologist who never heard about the ACE studies. I mean, in other words, yes, it's entirely possible to get training as a psychologist and not get the least hint of trauma, let alone your own. And then, of course, you're dealing with symptoms rather than causes. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a huge problem in the therapeutic world.
Yeah. Let me come back, if I may, to your discussion of the ayahuasca experience, and particularly the Icaros, these songs that the shamans sing. And I have a couple of questions. One is simply speculative. Do you have an idea, or can you imagine what ayahuasca's effects would be like without the rituals, without the Icaros, without the advanced work on the part of the shamans who are trained in healing and trained in noticing where injuries are and where blockages occur in people's psyche? So I guess that would be first question. In other words, how much is in the plant and how much is in the therapeutic training around the whole ceremony, ritual, and the creation of these Icaroses?
Yes. On brain scans, they don't seem to show much difference in short brain scan studies of people who undergo the ayahuasca experience with or without the Icaros. But that to me is not all that persuasive. That may be true on brain scans, but it's not about brain scans. It's about actually lived experience. The Icaros are not a song list that the shamans just trot out, like here's our playlist for tonight. The Icaros is based on the energetic experience of the shaman of you at that particular moment. And the Icaros all have a healing intention, and very often they're about other healing plants whose energy they bring into their songs because of what they're picking up from you. So in that particular Peruvian experience where the shaman said to me, "You are not ready to lead anybody here. You have to do your own healing." And they assigned a shaman to work with me alone. This guy chanted to me specifically based on what he was picking up from me, from my autonomic nervous system, from my gut, from my emotions, things that I wasn't even aware of. And the Icaros were, I don't say tailored, they were suited to my own particular experience at that moment. They can chant to you one thing and make you throw up. They can chant to you another way and make you relax. So that these aren't placebo effects. These are very specific effects. Now, of course, we're talking about one particular modality in the broad range of psychedelic experiences. So what I'm discussing is true for the ayahuasca experience as is traditionally developed in its place of origin. And unless we're very arrogant about it, we have to honor what the practitioners say about it. It's the experience of a lot of people. With other modalities, it's not quite the same, but certainly with ayahuasca, it is.
Yeah, and you just alluded to a story that's prominent in your in the discussion of psychedelics in your book, in which you talk about having gone down to lead a retreat for healthcare professionals, and they basically said, after getting to know you a little bit, no, you don't. You need to do your own work. We'd like you to actually not be part of the group. And in fact, you used as an image, which is, to my mind, both it's tender and heartwarming and very revealing. You said they picked up on my energy of being like Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh, and they thought, that's not going to be so helpful to the group. And then you entered into your own work. So I wonder if you could tell us what that must have been like. I mean, I'm imagining, unless you're really quite advanced, that the first thing would be, oh my God, some feelings of disappointment and like, what's this revealing about me? But then what happened in the experience, and you write about how it was really quite transformative.
Yeah. So 23 psychiatrists, psychologists, physicians, counselors, therapists had come from 4 or 5 continents to work with me in the Amazon jungle, and I wasn't going to lead the ceremonies, but I was going to guide people into the ceremonies and help them integrate afterwards, which is I'm quite adept at doing, and I've been doing for 12 years now. And after one night of chanting to us, where I was like a block of ice that couldn't be melted, these Shipibo shamans who knew nothing about my childhood or infant history or about who I was, they weren't impressed with the fact that I published 4 books and lectured, and they just saw the person, and they said, "Your energy is so dense that our Icaros can't penetrate it, and that denseness is affecting the others that you're supposed to be working with here. So we can't have you working with them. And we think also that you had a big scare when you were very young and you haven't got over it yet," which is, if you know my origin story, that's absolutely true. And so my first reaction was twofold. One is, I get it, because I sit there and not much happens for me because my mind is just too much in the way. I had also come from a long and tiring and stressful speaking trip, thinking, no, I'm going to go in and help heal all these people. Well, these shamans who knew nothing about me, historically, they picked up on that. And so something in me got it right away. I did get it. That, you know what, they're right. Amazing. That in one night, without speaking to me, without taking a history, just energetically, they picked up on my actual state, the way I was at that time. Now, my ego didn't like it, and what would I look like? I mean, what can I say? What a loss of face in front of all these professionals who come all over the world to work with me, But you know what? I let go of that pretty quickly because I knew that they were. So I give myself credit for letting go, because at another time I might have really have made difficulties and created a lot of hostility around this, being fired from my own retreat. But you know what? It's one of the best things that ever happened to me. So yeah, I had both reactions, but the one that got it is the one that predominated.
And can you tell us something about what happened then as you went through your own journeys with ayahuasca, guided by them, and with their interventions with Icaros and the like?
Well, so what happened for me is there were 6 Shipibo shamans, and 5 of them kept working with the group. And I was given a separate building, a separate malaka, ceremonial space with my own shaman. And I was alone with him, along with except for a translator. And so there was the 3 of us, and this man just chanted over me 3 or 4 hours a night for 5 nights over 10 days. And the rest of the time I was on my own, meditating and walking in the rainforest and all that. And I could feel myself loosen up and just relax day by day. And then I thought it was all over at the end of the 5th private ceremony. All of a sudden I was thrown on the ground by some force, and I had this experience that I describe in the book. I won't go into it now, but it was a revisioning of my life, which taught me that all that happened, but that doesn't have to define who I am or who I will be. So it's a potent experience.
And if I may ask you, in the days, weeks, and months afterwards, how did that experience live on in your consciousness, and did it change your behavior or change your thoughts and feelings over time?
I wish I could say yes, but this is truth or consequences in it, so I can't. So I came back from that trip really revivified and just gloriously relaxed. And then I plunged into writing the book. I had to, according to contract. And that was a tough goal. So very quickly I became very discouraged and even despondent that this time I've taken on more than I can chew, that this book is going to expose my utter incompetence to the world. So I had a tough time of it, but I had access to that experience. So if I had made space for it, I could get back to it. And that was a tremendous support to me. So it's like it automatically changed everything. These old circuits don't just evaporate overnight, but I had access to something new, to a totally different possible. And that really did help in writing the book. So I'm just so grateful that I had this experience just a week before I began to write the first chapter of this book.
Wow. And it is so interesting. I was just talking with Steve Hayes about this, that these experiences, when we're going into them, when we're in these healing spaces, we kind of don't also have a lot of executive functioning handy. In other words, it's about relinquishing the parts of our mind, the parts of our brain that are good at problem solving and warding off danger and the like. But we really have to let go of that in order to enter into these healing experiences. And then if we're sucked back into it, like by a book contract, it's hard, because it's very hard to stay that open. We can't actually stay that open and accomplish these difficult executive functioning tasks unless, I think, we're very, very advanced in our own, practice.
Well, yeah, and this is where the concept of integration is so important, so that when you come back from these experiences, you have to keep that door open, and that takes practice. So that takes integration, that takes talking with others. That means dwelling with the experience consciously. Integration is really, really important. And, this wasn't my first experience with ayahuasca by any means. And I've had all kinds of insights before, and nothing to this depth, but I've had insights and realizations before. But we lose them very quickly unless we do the essential work of integration, which, by the way, since we're talking about psychedelics in general, this is true not only for ayahuasca, but any psychedelic experience. And actually, those people who are able to get to these insights and breakthroughs without psychedelics, they're actually a step ahead. not to put on psychedelics, but to say that because you experienced it not in an altered state. Well, the altered state happened without something changing your physiology temporarily. So it's easier to integrate. But with psychedelics, the integration becomes all the more important. And fortunately, in the last several years, all kinds of groups and individuals have now realized that in our offerings, integration experiences and integration work, which I think is crucial.
Yeah. And my own experience, having been involved in the meditation world for some time, and particularly having done intensive mindfulness meditation retreats and leading clinicians through them, it is interesting. If you spend enough time in silence doing practice, some pretty profound altered states of non-ordinary states of consciousness arise. The same challenge is there. One can leave a retreat very opened up, very infused with love, very aware of the folly of self-preoccupied narratives and worrying about how people think about me and all that stuff. And yet it doesn't take long to reconstitute, a sort of scared, driven, addicted, personality constellation. And I remember Joseph Goldstein, who's some people know as a Vipassana teacher, did a lot to bring Vipassana practice to America and Europe and the like. And he used to say, look, this is great what happens, by day 7 on a retreat or even after a 3-month retreat. But it's all about continued practice. And here they're talking about using meditation as continued practice, but it's really about keeping the channels open, keeping the heart open, and doing something so we don't just get caught up again in a sort of fear-based, goal-oriented way of relating to experience. And it's not easy because, as you point out so starkly in the book, gosh, the culture sure lobbies in a different direction, right? Sure suggests that, what you really need is, a drink.
Yeah. Or what you need is some kind of escape from yourself. What you need is a product. What you need is some achievement, attainment, some recognition. That's part of the problem for us in today's world, is that we can have these healing experiences, but then we go back into the world that doesn't not only not support them, but it actually undermines them and pulls us in different directions. And this is true of any kind of healing work, and it's also true of psychedelic work. And so that we have to be all the more vigilant not to buy into the toxicity of the culture that we came from in order to maintain that healing momentum. Absolutely.
And there's probably a relationship between how suddenly and in what great contrast the opening into a mystical or transpersonal experience, or the experience of love, or the experience of connectedness, or the experience of seeing the folly of our narratives about ourselves, all of these kinds of openings, if they happen suddenly without a lot of preparation because the medicine was so powerful, my guess is we need even more on the integration end than if we more gradually brought ourselves that way through daily meditation practice, whatever the person is involved in, their own psychotherapy and the like. Do you see it that way?
Well, exactly. And that's one of the concerns I have about psychedelic work, is that it can be so powerful and so illuminating, and at least in a moment, so liberating, that one keeps looking for that same experience. And then when one does a kind of a bypass, now this is what they also call spiritual bypass. You can have beautiful meditation breakthroughs, experiences, and sense of wonder and unity, which then becomes your goal to keep having those experiences, and you don't do the integration work so that what you saw and learned and intuited shows up in your daily life. And that's what they call spiritual bypass. And that is certainly possible with the psychedelics as well.
Yeah, it's a different kind of getting hooked on getting high than the hooked on getting high of opiates or alcohol or something. But it's still getting hooked on not having to deal with the nitty-gritty challenges of being a human being in relationship in the world.
Exactly. And that's one of the number of concerns that I have about psychedelic assisted therapy or psychedelic experience in general. As much as I favor it and have practiced it both myself and for others, that's one of my concerns.
Yeah, no, you make clear in the book that you're, and there is a danger in this current cultural moment of people becoming unambivalent
Yeah.
advocates of this, and not noticing, oh, well, it's complicated and there's a lot that can go wrong. Are there other things that particularly stand out for you that you wind up being concerned about?
Yeah. I was talking to Michael Pollan, who, of course, wrote How to Change Your Mind, the seminal book on psychedelics that everybody knows, and the TV series that he's just aired. And I asked him, what do you think explained the success of your book, which he himself was surprised by? And he says, it's because, and he was particularly surprised by the response from the medical profession, which he expected to be a negative and skeptical one, but he experienced a lot of openness and curiosity, because he says a lot of physicians know how thin their toolkit actually is to help people with emotional and mental distress. Now, so that anything that comes along that's promising, like psychedelics, will naturally gather a lot of interest. My issue there is that the medical system and the treatment system in general is so divorced from reality, is so unaware of the pervasiveness and depth of trauma, is so unaware of the interaction of mind and body and the relationship of social issues and conditions to individual, what we call pathology, that something comes along that looks miraculously positive. We try and put all our eggs into that basket.
Yeah.
But the real transformation of therapy and healing in this world is not going to come from psychedelics. Psychedelics will be a powerful support and a modality I would not want to do without. But I think the task is much greater than that. And the tendency is that we narrow our vision to something, much like happened with pharmacology, in the 60s and 70s. All of a sudden, we got these medications. Oh boy, never going to put all our eggs into that basket, which is what psychiatry did. I hope that the therapeutic world doesn't make the same mistake with psychedelics. For all the differences between psychiatric drugs and psychedelics, I don't want to put all eggs into that basket. I think the issue and the problem is much broader than that.
And the danger of missing what's such an important theme in your book, which is what are the influences in the culture that pull us in the direction of greater suffering? And because it's very, very hard to free our own hearts and minds if we're in a milieu which is continuing to reinforce the patterns that trap us.
Well, and that's the age-old spiritual challenge, isn't it? How to be in the world without being of it. And I think spiritual adepts have been addressing that question since the dawn of time, and it certainly is also true for psychedelics.
The book, interestingly, is written by you, but with your son.
Yes.
And the book is, well researched, very well written, very well edited, and very personal, right? It contains a lot of, you really share your humanity in it, and your vulnerability as a human being, and your foibles. And I just wonder what the process was like doing the book with your son.
Well, and my son talks about how he was traumatized in his family of origin, which is to say, in our family when he was small. So we've had a lot of repair work to do. And as a matter of fact, we have a 2-book contract. This was the first one. I was the main writer on this one. He was an essential co-writer. I could not have done this without my brilliant son. But my next book is going to be 50-50, and it's going to be called Hello Again, A Fresh Start for Adult Children and Their Parents.
Mm-hmm.
It's a workshop that we actually do together based on our own travails. In fact, people can look on YouTube, and the first workshop we gave was 2016, and part of that is filmed, and you can see us still tense with each other on stage in front of a live audience. Like, one thing about our family, we don't hide our stuff, So this process was not only essential support to me in getting the book done, but it was also highly healing for my son and I. Mm-hmm. We were in the same dyad at the end as we were in the beginning. We had to really accommodate to each other's working styles, respect the other's individuality, understand how our responses affected the other's feelings, find a modus vivendi when we disagreed. So it was a beautiful process that ended, I hope, beautifully for the reader, and I'm quite confident that it did, but also very beautifully for us, which is doesn't mean that our work is over. but it was a real learning journey for us as a father and son.
And talk about the opposite of a spiritual bypass, right? To actually work these things out in relationship as you're working on producing something to offer to the world.
And as we did, the book became lighter and lighter. And so as we rewrote the book, we wrote through this book several times. By the last rewrite, it was much lighter than it had been in it, because our relationship had lightened.
Well, thank you. I so appreciate your taking the time out during this particularly busy time. And the book, again, is, here we go. You deserve for people to know about it. And if they're interested to get a copy, the Myth of Normal. And it's just a delight for me to, I've been with you on other occasions, but it's a delight to be with you again and really hear your thoughtful reflections and your humility and openness and not posturing as being other than another human being on his own path in this world. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Ron, it's always a pleasure to interact with you, whether in person as we did in San Diego or whether online as we have a number of times. So I thank you too for your hospitality and having me, and great to see you.
Great to see you.